Right, welcome everybody back after a very early lunch brunch. It's my pleasure to chair the 9th panel of this conference, which is on law. We will start with Jenny Day from Skidmore College, talking about political crimes and international law in modern China. Then we'll go to LALE Chan from City University in New York, talking about the Caliphate difference for Muslims and differentiated rights in the late Ottoman Empire. Then we will move online to Florian Wagner, who will join us to talk about global Islam and the law of empire, imperial emulation and the role of indigenous knowledge. And then finally, we conclude with a paper by ANNE-ISABELLE of the Graduate Institute at the Crossroads of Crumbling Empires, Contending Languages of Legitimation in Egyptian Politics and Exile in the Early 20th Century. Somebody commented on long titles. And if you read any, I think any title, if you read it out, is quite long. Anyway, Jenny Day.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Cyrus and Irina and the Swiss National Science Foundation for this incredible opportunity to step into this world of ideas and connection. Thank you so much. In my text, I laid out some of the overall ideas of the project. So here I will just flesh out a couple of ideas relevant to the theme of this conference. I'll begin with a story. In July 1865, Colonel William Henry Sykes, a member of the British Parliament, wrote a letter to Earl Russell, the foreign minister, condemning Britain's role in the extradition and the brutal execution of a Taiping rebel chief who sought refuge under the British flag in Hong Kong. Sykes charged that the British consul, Daniel Burke Robertson, and the Hong Kong acting governor, William Thomas Mercer, should be held responsible for their complicity in the extradition of a political offender, or at least for being so gullible and being tricked by the Chinese into thinking that the offense was simply for piracy. Upon receiving these letters, Earl Russell conducted a detailed investigation and reached the conclusion 6 months later that the conduct of the British officials was perfectly blameless, of course, and that the prisoner was not a Taiping rebel, but indeed a Chinese pirate and a boat robber. So according to this view, Sykes was confused by the opaqueness of the Chinese legal system. And scholarship since then has largely followed this verdict and treated the case as somewhat uninteresting. Well, my research at the British and the Chinese archives showed that Sykes was not mistaken at all. The man was a rebel leader, and he had been mainly responsible for smuggling ammunition and arms through Hong Kong to inland rebels in the Canton region. Now, what's interesting is not the identity of the rebel, but how his extradition was done. It was done by a series of well-timed collaborations, some intentional, some quite accidental, between the Qing local officials and the British consul in Canton. It was also made possible because of the cross-border desire shared by the Hong Kong governor and the Qing provincial officials in finding ways of collaboration in cross-border jurisdiction without the high-level interference of their respective superiors in London or Beijing. Okay. So the case had long-lasting implications to how subsequent diplomats, judges, and scholars of international law approached extradition with China in the next few decades. On the most obvious level, it cemented the British imagination of the Chinese penal code as cruel and arbitrary, even more so than previously thought, and encoded this understanding into new laws and legal norms. More importantly, it resulted in a fundamental change in the implementation of extradition law with China, shifting the legal basis of judging extraditable crimes from Chinese law to British law. And by doing so, it introduced the European idea of political crimes or political offenses and defined it as a category of crimes excluded from extradition to China, despite the fact that in the treaties which Britain had just signed with the Qing a few years prior, there was no hint of such an exception. Now, this was not a singular case, but one among several that I've found so far. It's important because it not only affected China's ability to recover fugitives from colonies and treaty ports, but in how it kept China out of an emerging inter-imperial order over the jurisdiction of cross-border fugitives and criminals in the last decades of the 19th century. But here's the thing. Legal opinions about extradition shifted significantly in the decades spanning the turn of the 20th century, and what actions counted as political crimes, and how motives, ideology, and strategies played into the definition of political offender changed. In fact, the decisive debate within England about whether political offenses should be included in future treaties with France would not take place until after my opening anecdote. Extradition treaties proliferated after the 1870s among the civilized states whose legal systems were considered comparable to each other. At the same time, the effects of exclusion from the regime of inter-imperial justice also became more pronounced. It is perhaps only with hindsight that we can see the problems in equating leaders of Chinese rebellions with the concept of the political offender in the European legal tradition. In a society such as the Qing in the 19th century, where political authority or power was not constituted from above, but diffused into family, kinship, community, and religious structures, large-scale rebellions were seldom purely political. They were often achieved through prolonged armed conflicts of a millenarian nature. In these cases, the political offense exception in extradition law posed a much larger threat to both local and central governance, and indeed the very legitimacy of the imperial foundation than in contemporary Western political systems, where the term signified a somewhat different range of political possibilities. Now, I hope that I won't be seen as defending the Chinese legal system and its miserable treatment of criminals. That's not my point. I'm pointing out that laws which seem reciprocal, equitable, and humane often do not have the same effects on societies of different legal structures and political systems. When the Hong Kong colonial authorities insisted that they would not be complicit in the exercise of brutality by delivering rebel leaders to the Chinese justice, this would come at a cost to local judicial orders of the nearby canton. Now, I want to pause here and connect this to one set of the transimperial and interimperial approaches highlighted by Cyrus in his text, the idea that TII should not just prioritize flows and connectivities, but also interruptions, cover-ups, and mechanisms of exclusion, to borrow the terms of Nadine and Daniel. These apply, I would argue, to people, groups, as well as regions, empires, and legal systems. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, this was just the beginning of the story that I want to tell. In the next few decades, many European states were shaken by violent political movements and frequent assassination attempts by anarchists and socialists. And during this period, we will see that European legal experts would come to predict that the extradition of political offenders would very soon become one of the most recognized means of stopping revolution in Europe. And so there's a fundamental change in this concept and how it was adjudicated in the early 20th century. And indeed, they signed new treaties and worked out legal accommodations, some quite shady and amount to turning a blind eye to cross-border police abductions, to bring fugitives and other criminals in both colonial and metropolitan cities under the law. But despite minor tweaks, the exclusion of China from this extradition regime continued, and this came at a time when the Qing needed more than ever the ability to bring back fugitives to justice. It couldn't, simply couldn't. And this vulnerability was well known among rebels and outlaws, which often had legal counsels. and this effectively opened up a legal space for fugitive rebels to fashion themselves in a way that appealed to the sensibilities of various powers. Now, it might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing. I'm not making a value judgment here, right? But the most prominent case is Sun Yat-sen's invention of himself from a bomb-throwing rebel to a liberal Christian thinker during his travel in London, where he was captured for forced rendition back to China by the Qing legation in London, but eventually gained his release when the press intervened. In Sun's case and many others, the adoption of liberal ideas had a legal context that we should not ignore. In conclusion, I'd like to return to the larger themes covered by many papers in this conference. In an age of nationalist revolution and anti-colonial movements, rebels and revolutionaries from China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Burma, the Philippines, and so on fought against the legal and security apparatus for their national freedom and for anti-colonialism. And these waves of attacks, many of which came later under the sponsorship of the Soviet Union, upon the existing political orders, would engender new ideas about crime, justice, and punishment, leading to new inventions of extraditable crimes, international crime being one of them, and transnationalization of criminal law. In particular, political crime, once protected under liberalist policies, would be now considered social crimes inimical to the international order and perfectly good for extradition. And these changes in international law suggest new ways of thinking about revolution in a transimperial and interimperial context. It also makes it possible to denaturalize political labels, ideology, and chronology, to detach them from a teleology of liberalism and to reconceptualize them as mercurial concepts embedded within transimperial processes. Thank you so much.
It's been a long time since I've been standing in front of a large group of people like this. So it's really fascinating to actually listen to Jenny, because I'm also starting a project on exile and have worked on questions related to international law. And just hearing already, I'm like, oh, maybe that's why the Ottomans don't send people abroad. They exile them internally, so they don't have to deal with these kinds of questions. But that's not what I will be talking about today. What I'll be talking about relates to my earlier book project. So I'll say a few words about that, but I want to begin by extending my warmest thanks to Cyrus for the invitation to be a part of this conference, to David, who's over here, for making such a complicated event come to fruition, and the Du Bois Foundation for its generous support of this endeavor. Like many of you have earlier expressed, it's really wonderful to be here in person and to have the chance to talk about themes of common interest and all things inter and transimperial. I'm very happy to meet and hope that these conversations will continue later this afternoon and also beyond Geneva. My presentation this afternoon and the paper that I pre-circulated draw on my first book, which was a study of the late Ottoman Hajj, specifically a history of pilgrimage-related travel and migration from Central Asia, and the questions of legal belonging, nationality, and rights that emerged within this context in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Whereas historians have long focused on pan-Islam as a framework for studying the Hajj pilgrimage and the various forms of connections among the Ottomans and Central Asians, as well as a host of other Muslims from across what is now being referred to as the Muslim world. In this paper and in this talk, I'd like to discuss what I see as some of the problems in this approach and how this connects to my understanding of transimperial history, both as method and also a way to understand the mobility of people, across, that are highly mobile across these disparate imperial frameworks. And to end with a question, which I think is the question that I did end the paper with, whether we can abandon this framework for understanding the complex dynamics among Muslims in the age of high imperialism and talk instead about transimperial connections. So what I tried to do in my larger project was to reconstruct the experiences and trajectories of people that I refer to as ordinary people, for lack of a better term, non-elites, and to look at their engagements with the extraterritorial legal order that shaped Ottoman history in this period, and mobility across empires in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in very broad brushstrokes, the story in the paper can be understood against the backdrop or in the context of, first, the heightened mobility among Muslims in the second half of the 19th century, an era referred to as the Steamship Era, and how this overlapped with the expansion of formal and informal empire. So I'm looking at people from colonies as well as protectorates and protected states in Asia. A second major theme in this period is again related to this, the growth of an international legal order where international is really Eurocentric, right, which is something also that I think a lot of other people working on this period have engaged with. The growth of this international Eurocentric legal order where European powers are expanding their authority beyond their territory by conferring extraterritorial privileges and protections to their citizens and subjects and nationals, as well as protégés in Ottoman lands. So these extraterritorial privileges are referred to as the capitulations. These were grants that were originally awarded by the Ottoman Empire in a period of the height of Ottoman power in the 16th century, but later become enshrined in treaties and binding agreements, and that are sort of incorporated into the body of international law and collectively referred to as the capitulations. This conferral of these types of privileges to Muslims from these colonies and protectorates is something that we can think of in the terms that Lauren Benton uses as casting shadows of sovereignty beyond imperial territory itself. Another parallel development in this period is that we have a weakening Ottoman Empire that's increasingly subject to forms of informal imperialism, legal imperialism, economic imperialism, and the pressures of the capitulations, which are continually eroding Ottoman sovereignty, right? So this is a really key issue in this story that I tell. So what we see and what I try to sort of draw your attention to in the paper is the ways that the Ottoman state responds to these pressures, right? So firstly, we can think of the promotion of the Ottoman Caliphate, which is something that has been written about extensively, right, and relates to this broader picture, this broader story of pan-Islamism. But in a less studied development are policies towards Muslims in Ottoman lands within the empire's domains who were not Ottomans, right? And policies that differentiated among Muslims in terms of their legal rights. So it's important to note here that I'm not talking about Muslim refugees and migrants, the muhajirin in Vladimir's research and others, right? That these are not muhajirin. They are not received in the empire as migrants in these terms. These are pilgrims who sometimes become migrants. You see a lot of mobility one way and return migration, as well as repeated travel, even though it's very difficult in this period, and people who are moving throughout the empire. So we have not only linkages between Ottoman lands and Russia and China, but also between Istanbul and Mecca and Medina, Istanbul and other rising trade ports and cities, right? So there's a lot of mobility in this story. So these are people who I argue blur the lines between pilgrims and migrants. So one of the main themes that I bring up in this paper is that scholars have often used the term the lens of pan-Islam, which is understood as an imperial ideology promoting Muslim political and religious unity under the aegis of the Ottoman Caliphate, that's accompanied by the rise of non-state actors and networks advocating for Muslim solidarity, right? This is often associated with the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II, as well as the Young Turk regime that comes to power after the Constitutional Revolution. Figures like Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu, other major pan-Islamic thinkers. So what I would like to talk about, I guess, is to think about what are some of the problems in this approach, right? And so this is a very rich literature. It builds on certain foundational texts written earlier in the 20th century. There's been innovations in it, but it still dominates a lot of the discussion of all Muslim-Muslim interactions, right? So in this paper, I take up Jamie Eiden's argument, which I'm actually very sympathetic to and that I like, and that I think is very important for explaining a range of phenomena in a broader global Islamic trans-imperial history, right? But yet that still, I think, rests on certain generalizations that I find to be somewhat problematic. So I guess the issue that I have is thinking about religious political ideology as the dominant framework for understanding a broad range of connections and using terms like global Muslim subjectivities, which I think obscure a lot more than they reveal. Right? So some of the problems in this approach we can think of in terms of empirically, right? So Pan-Islam doesn't really explain all that much in terms of the actions of people who are part of this very mobile world, who are traveling, right, in their day-to-day lives or in their choices, the kinds of things that they're doing, the types of legal questions or things related to property, nationality, practices such as affiliation switching, refashioning of identities to gain rights. We don't see ideology really at work here, right? So empirically, I think that this is somewhat of a problem, and I can expand on this. But in the book, like there are a lot of case studies that I use of people who are migrants, pilgrims from places like Bukhara, from East Turkestan in Qing and then later Republican China, people from Afghanistan who have lived in the Ottoman Empire for long periods of time, who have benefited from the rights of Ottoman nationality, even if they have not officially naturalized, but then get into trouble with the law, are subject to taxation and conscription like Ottoman subjects, or who are also engaged in activity in the economic sphere that want to benefit from the reduced tariffs, the types of things that would allow them to compete with non-Muslim merchants and people who can benefit from the capitulations. So in these engagements with the law and this legal order, as well as in after death when people are claimed as subjects of different empires, I don't think that Pan-Islam is empirically a very useful framework for understanding a lot of the things that are happening in the quote-unquote Muslim world. So methodologically, Pan-Islam, I think, is problematic in some ways because it reifies Islam in our analysis and renders the Ottomans as somewhat exceptional, right? So that, again, in this broad range of dynamics, particularly in the legal and economic spheres, from Hajj patronage to philanthropy to the use of the law, right, including Muslims trying to gain protection from European empires while they're abroad, even if they don't have the status of citizens in the metropole that can benefit from the rights of that nationality when they're traveling in the caliph's domains. All of these things end up being lumped under this very nebulous rubric of Pan-Islam, right? And what happens here, in addition to reifying Islam, is that these developments are then somehow outside of the main currents of history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? So the Ottomans become sort of exceptionalized in that way, where religion is used to explain a host of things that it doesn't really explain. There's also, I think, a discomfort among historians of the Middle East to not engage with Islam and religion because of years of worrying about Orientalism. So this seems to me, and to my mind, to be a way to say, well, it's not religion, it's the religious and political ideology of Islamic unity, right? And so somehow this is kind of like a way to get around that. So finally, another problem that I see in this approach is that if we think of Pan-Islamism as it has long been studied as something that's also anti-colonial in nature, then this whole history becomes about something that's in opposition to Europe, right? And that also doesn't really help us to explain many of the things that are happening in this period. So that we have the Ottomans who are engaging with the international legal order that are, often to their chagrin or, they're resistant to it, but they are accepting colonialism as part of that project, right? So, or people who, might be engaged in various modes of anti-colonial resistance, but at the same time don't have qualms about benefiting from the privileges of that nationality while they're abroad because they are, at the end of the day, rational actors, right? That ideology doesn't determine all of their choices. So in the story of the book and in the paper is that what I'm trying to argue is that these people from all of these different empires, we see them, like other mobile actors in this period, trying to take advantage of extraterritorial rights and privileges enshrined in the capitulatory regime, and that in response, the Ottoman Empire tries to stymie these developments. So, as I explained, one of the things that it does is, in this 1869 law on Ottoman nationality, is to ultimately differentiate within the Ummah, the imagined universal Islamic community, between people who are Ottomans and then those who are not Ottomans. So we have these categories of Ottoman and foreigner and foreign Muslims that emerge, right? So here is the first level of differentiation. So that you have in what is imagined as this Islamic community, Ottoman Muslims and foreign Muslims. Then you also have the foreign ministry's response trying to prevent people from taking advantage of the capitulations, where they distinguish between subjects, real colonial subjects, so people who are originating from India, from Russian Turkestan, from Algeria, versus people who are not real colonial subjects, and these are according to Eurocentric international legal norms, people from protected states. So Bukhara, Afghanistan, Tunisia, right? And so this is a second level of differentiation that we see emerging, right? So so I think that this is part of a story that has long been obscured because of the assumptions about these types of pan-Islamic unity, right? So kind of what I try to get at here is that for a long time, we focused on the aspirations of pan-Islamic thinkers and intellectuals, but that using a legal lens allows us to see actually both the ways in which people acted in ways that were not consistent with those types of aspirations at the individual, apologizing to the microphone, at the individual level, but also on the state level, right? This is the Ottoman Caliphate, right? And so here, this is, and I will wrap it up here soon. So here, what I think is really, really important is that at the same time that we're looking at people acting in these ways where they're trying to maximize their rights, this is, the Caliphate is very much a part of the structure of the Ottoman state. The Ottoman Sultan is Sultan and Caliph, two hats in one. They're not separate, right? And for a really, really long time, I think that people have approached this in a way in which the Caliphate is understood as some sort of separate symbolic institution, right? It becomes the object of longing. It becomes something that's understood symbolically, something that the Ottomans can use to instrumentalize, to increase their power. But this is not the way. There is no ministry of the Caliphate. All of these decisions are part of the structure of power. The Foreign Ministry Office of Legal Counsel is making decisions about what the Caliphate means vis-a-vis foreign Muslims, right? And that this is, at the same time, these policies of differentiation are not inimical to the idea that the Sultan is also the Caliphate. So here, where in the paper I engage with Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper's argument about the politics of difference, the point that I'm trying to make here, again, is that the Caliphate is very much integrated into a long history of state power, right? And that there is not a problem for the Ottoman state in differentiating among Muslims and according them different types of rights, right? So again, rather than a symbolic institution, the Caliphate is part of the structure of the power in the state, right? So a lot of times when I've talked about this work in the past, I've gotten a lot of, so maybe I'm trying to preempt some of these kinds of questions because I don't find them to be particularly productive, is that people's understandings of pan-Islam are often based on like the Khilafat movement, which is after the end of the empire, right? Or towards the end of the empire. So this doesn't help us understand what's happening in late Ottoman history when we think about Indian Muslims' engagement with what the Caliphate means, right? And at the same time, with the end of the empire and the formation of the Turkish Republic, when you have the attempt in 1922 to abolish, the Sultanate is abolished, the Caliphate remains for another 2 years, and then the Caliphate is abolished, I would argue that this is because of that Ottoman generation that continues the continuities of the Republic into the empire into the Republican period, is that they are also very well aware that there is no way in which, if the Ottomans' main if we can say that their main project at the end of empire was to preserve and defend their sovereignty, that there's no way that the Turkish Republic can maintain its sovereignty with an institution that is part of an extraterritorial order where Muslims are always going to be making claims vis-a-vis engagements with that caliphate, right? So I think we can talk about that after. So one last thing that I want to say is that, I guess the point that I'm trying to make here, and in terms of the questions that Cyrus had posed to us, was thinking, what is the value of thinking about transimperial and interimperial connections, politics, using this as an approach, is that I think in this context, really looking at the engagements of ordinary people with the law and the Ottoman state's responses to it allow us to get away from these really broad abstract concepts that do work in Islamic transimperial histories of the Ottoman Empire, that that seek to do work that they don't really do, right? So in terms of, as an analytic, it's not that I don't think Pan-Islam is a thing, that we shouldn't engage with it. I don't think that it works as an analytical framework or as an interpretive framework, right? So that in the same ways that we don't study nationalism through the writings of nationalists, I think that it might be time to move beyond engaging primarily with the writings and activities of Pan-Islamic thinkers and their aspirations for Islamic unity, right? And that instead we should look at what's happening on the ground in the places where these trans-imperial Islamic connections are being forged. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Am I supposed to start?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so hello everyone, and thank you so much to Cyrus and David for organizing this and inviting me to the conference. I'm more than sad that I cannot be there in person and cancelled on short notice. I thought this kind of bad news related to the pandemics are over, but the end is not yet there. And I always have Luis's keynote title in my head, now you see it and now you don't, which if applied to the end of the pandemic captures quite well, I think, what we lived through in the last 2 years. But then I'm also optimistic that we'll have the chance to meet again soon, and we see the end then together. So talking about titles, I took the freedom after all the criticism to shorten my title and tried to share that right now. If you don't see that, let me know, please. Which is now the International Colonial Institute, Islamic Corporative Law, and now I don't see my own title, and Eurafrica. Also, because I realized that I'm talking less about Islam and indigenous knowledge or institutions as such, but about how colonial experts tried to manipulate it and distort it, both Islam and indigenous institution, to an extent that it was even distorted beyond recognition. So my paper was a bit sketchy, and I'm really glad that all these eminent scholars are here who can help me to improve it and to correct it in many ways. Perhaps two preliminary remarks about my approach, which I have discussed a lot with students and others, and I think it's important to emphasize that we are very fascinated, I think, as post-nationalist historians with all these connections and entanglements between empires. And I think this is very important to identify them, to enumerate them. But then, of course, we should think about what that means for the nature of empire in the end. Well, the nature of empire is very dramatic. Let's put it like for the colonial situation, as Georges Ballandier called it, where there is not only colonizer versus colonized and colonialists versus anti-colonialists. So I think it's really important to think about that. We have done that partly in a conference that was already mentioned. We organized in 2018 at Erfurt University, where we thought about it. And now I have to see how to get to the second slide. We thought about it in terms of triangulation of relations within and across empires, which didn't really work well because then we had, instead of 2 essentialized groups, we had 3 of them, and we felt the need more angles to tackle that. So it was somehow unsatisfying. In my book that was recently published, I tried to solve it by using the term of governmentality, which I think is still important. I cannot change the title of the book now, so that is something that I will, of course, still endorse, that this is a fitting concept. I mean, we've been talking about soft power coming from this trans-imperial realm. And I think governmentality may be, of course, in the Foucauldian sense, but then with the comments of the subaltern group who said that there is not only governmentality where people govern through experts, discourses, categories, and of course they govern themselves, but there's also, in the end, the state is able to intervene with violence, with armies, and with dispossessions, for example, so that these things are included in this term governmentality. We continue to explore that in our blog Transimperial History, which is also a network, and I encourage you to take a look at it and also maybe join the network. So that is one point. The second point is that I think it is important to note that all these connections, trans-imperial transfers and entanglement do not mean that the whole empire story is becoming dynamic through them. I mean, we have this idea that there is the bad imperialism, the conquest of the 19th century, then it gets a bit better in the interwar period with the League of Nations, more of kind of a humanitarian colonialism by trans-imperializing the whole project. And then, of course, after 1945, the developmentalist colonialism that is sort of more geared towards functional governance. And I sort of also in my book turn against this idea that empires are the precondition of progress and modernization. I mean, we have abandoned that for the nation state recently, and probably it's a pitfall to apply that now to empires, and we have to beware of that to see them as these kind of preconditions of modernization. Which brings me also to an idea that we haven't discussed that much, maybe to include more of post-colonial theory, also the concepts and vocabulary in our discussions about trans-imperial history. But coming back to the governmentality aspect, I would like to shortly present the International Colonial Institute and show how it affected this idea of colonial imperial governmentality. So the International Colonial Institute was established in 1893 by colonial experts from 13 different countries who considered themselves reformers and liberals. They partly rejected colonialism as a nationalist, imperialist, and emotional project. Through comparison and transfers, they pretended to rationalize colonial rule and bring about a sort of participative and governmental empire based on the respect for indigenous societies and cultural relativism. By the First World War, the ICI had around 200 members, all white and male. Among them, the most important colonial experts such as Lugard, Liberté, Thys, Dernburg, and many others. In the interwar period, the ICI supplied the League of Nations with colonial experts. Try to show you the chronology shortly. But then turned towards fascist trans-imperialism in the 1930s. After its re-establishment in 1949, it renamed itself Institute of Differing Civilizations, and I will show why this name is less progressive than it seems. The ICI got involved in almost all aspects of colonial praxis, from railway building, tropical hygiene, colonial agriculture, recruitment of labor, colonial law, and other things. An important project was the ICI's governmental use of Islamic corporative and customary cooperative institutions to bring about economic development while avoiding political freedom and participation for the colonized. In accordance with its governmentality program, the ICI recommended using traditional Islamic craft guilds and what they called customary agricultural cooperatives to carefully introduce a capitalist economy without granting the freedoms that capitalism might entail. The globality of Islam and its trans-imperial nature was a key for these colonial experts to invent and manipulate both Islamic law and this idea of introducing corporation. Islam was as diverse as it was global, and experts of the ICI used this diversity. For example, they imported and applied elements of different law schools in Sunni Islam to areas where they had previously not existed. For example, to also invent corporatist traditions. On top of that, ICI members were inspired by the enormous Dutch project to codify the so-called Adat law in Indonesia between 1900 and the 1930s. And the most important proponent of this Adat law was a famous ICI member, Christian van Vollenhoven. The proponents of Adatization argued that Islamic law was actually closer to customary law, the Arabic term Adat, than to Quranic law, because it preserved pre-Islamic and local customs in different regions of different empires. On these grounds, the Islamic institution of craft guilds and the customary institution of rural cooperatives that they promoted for the colonial economy seemed to share both an inclination to this kind of collective work. The ICI's comparative studies revealed that cooperative and cooperative structures existed in most colonies. North Africa and the Middle East had long tradition of Islamic craft guilds. East African coffee planters and West African groundnut growers were organized in a cooperative way. In India and Indonesia, there were both rural and urban cooperatives, while Asian and African traditions converged in Madagascar, which was very important for this project. Based on the ICI's comparative research on craft guilds and cooperatives, and the idea that corporatism was part of Islamic law, the ILO worked on recommendation of ICI members on a so-called, I quote, Muslim Code of Labors since the 1920s. In theory, craft guilds and rural cooperatives were self-organized cells of economic production based on mutuality and self-help. Cooperatives purchased primary materials and tools for the joint production and marketing, serving also as credit associations. ICI members were convinced that these corporations, and they could use these corporations and craft guilds to avoid the dangerous effects of colonizations on the colonized. That is, detribalization, alienation, and proletarization, and in the end, of course, to avoid the penetration of communism and also anti-colonialist unrest into the colonies. Given their conservative nature, cooperation and cooperatives even seemed to provide a manageable organ of political representation in the colonies. They were less democratic as assumed, rather hierarchically organized, easy to control, and especially they could replace their leaders if necessary, and they did that as well. In praxis, colonial experts of the ICI turned corporations and cooperatives into a tool to avoid real democracy. And more than that, into a tool to perpetuate enforced labor, collective punishment, additional taxation, and also the expropriation of land. When the ILO banned forced labor from the colonies in the 1930s, ICI members argued that corporations and cooperatives actually required collective and public works, and that was in the nature of the indigenous people. So in so doing, the colonial experts could argue in favor of enforcing compulsory work on the colonized, which came close to the idea of public work that has been cited already. The strategy became even more important after 1938, when ICI members closed ranks with fascist colonial experts who promoted and partly realized a corporatist state that extended from Europe to Africa and particularly emphasized the symbiosis of fascist rural cooperatives and Islamic corporatism. Meeting in 1938, on Mussolini's initiative in Rome, liberal ICI members and representatives from fascist Italy, Vichy France, Nazi Germany designed what they called a corporatist Eurafrica. They declared Africa a complementary space that supplied the European economy with crops and reorganized Eurafrica along corporatist lines. Curiously, both the corporatist Eurafrica and the allegedly indigenous cooperative tradition had an afterlife in the post-fascist world. First, the ICI's experts and their notion of governmentality through these institutions made their way into development agencies and international organizations who continued to regard cooperatives as a crucial tool for educating especially Africans about collective work. And I have some examples that I can mention in the discussion. The persistence of hyper-paternalistic cooperative and cooperative schemes was also in the agenda both of dictatorships, but also found their way into the agenda of the ILO, FAO, and the UN institutions in the 1950s and the 1960s. So they illustrate sort of the continuity of the ICI's trans-imperial governmentality in the 20th century. More than that, the general idea of organizing Eurafrica along a corporatist lines found its way into the early European economic community. As we have heard from ANNE-ISABELLE and others, the European Economic Community associated African colonies in the European Economic Area in its foundational treaty of 1957. The ICI, whose members played a crucial role in inventing and designing Eurafrica, continued claiming that there's a specific corporatist labor code to Islamic and customary law that allowed for and actually required legal and political segregation within a common Eurafrican community. ICI members who called the Institute of Differing Civilization in 1949 now claimed that the differing civilizations, such as Islam, but also, for example, the Bantu civilization, they're now accepted as a civilization or have done for a long time actually, that these civilizations needed a separated legal and political existence within the economic Eurafrican community. Thus, without giving African equal political rights, let alone the right to vote, the EEC designed a corporate federation that enabled Europe to access African resources without granting the basic freedoms and democracy to the inhabitants. Since the ICI designed this kind of corporatist Eurafrica since, I would argue, 1893, when it was founded, it is hardly surprising that in 1959, the General Secretary of the ICI, which was now the Institute of Differing Civilization, who both shaped and observed the new Africa, concluded that, and I quote him, "This is what we have been doing for the last 50 years." End of quote. And I will also conclude with this sentence. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
All right, I will try to compensate for the length of my title with the shortness of my presentation. Make up for this. Thank you so much, everybody, as well, for organizing this and for funding it, and thank you, and for giving me the opportunity to present here at this wonderful conference, and especially on this particularly cool panel, actually. My case study focuses on, oh wait, there should actually be some slides, in the ideal case. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So, my study focuses on a group of Egyptian exiles in actually mostly Switzerland, but also in other places in Europe, in the decade of the First World War, roughly 1910 to 1919. They were politically heterogeneous groups. Most of them were actually students studying at Swiss universities, mostly in the French-speaking part here, around Geneva and Lausanne and Fribourg. They spent most of their time in Geneva. At some point, Stockholm comes into play, and also Berlin. And they printed really extensive propaganda materials against British foreign rule in Egypt. And that's what I was looking at. So when I looked at these propaganda materials that they printed here in this decade, it struck me that they argued their case in roughly 4 different languages of legitimation, as I call it. Sorry, too quick. It was always about renegotiating the power relationship to Great Britain, of course, but they kind of argued it in different ways. So I pre-circulated this short paper about, just to present you with what I think, how I want to use this idea of languages of legitimation, but I think it will become fairly clear what I mean with it when I tell you what. And my argument that I want to make basically is that they use these languages of legitimation as kind of as rhetoric strategies to make their point, to make potential alliances, and make potential friends, since they were in a really fragile position, right? Egypt was formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, had been occupied by the British, and with the outbreak of the war was annexed and declared a protectorate. And they found themselves here in Switzerland, which wasn't even really like directly connected to any of this, so they were kind of in a fragile position. Or from a different perspective, we could also say that with the geopolitical shifts, their language also changed and their analysis of the situation of Egypt also changed. So my 3 most prominent subjects, who were most productive actually in their publication activities here, are these 3 gentlemen. Of the second one, unfortunately, there's no picture, I don't have one. So Mohammed Farid was the president of the Egyptian National Party. He settled in Switzerland in 1912, but he had been here before for conferences and so on, networking with people. And he also set up a series of Egyptian student organizations, actually starting here in Geneva, at the University of Geneva, but then they spread out in different universities, mostly in France, but also to London. They were all called Sphinx societies. The second one is Mohammed Fahmy. He was, as Farid actually, he was trained as a lawyer. He had lived in Switzerland for a longish time in Geneva. He was also a private lecturer at the Geneva University for law. And he also published extensively. And the third is Mansour Rifat, who was a kind of transnationally connected radical who was not a lawyer, he was actually a medical doctor. But more on him later. So now, the first of these languages of legitimation, so to say, that they used is that of international law, the kind of liberal argument. Here the main argument was about the Convention of London of 1840. It was about going back to the Egypt as an autonomous tributary to the Ottoman Empire, and about reconvening the Egyptian parliament. Of course, it was stood in context with all the constitutional reform movements that happened in the world, and so on. And this was also the established kind of line of argument of the Egyptian National Party, and also of the young Egyptians, which Mohammed Fahmy, I forgot to mention, actually founded in Geneva in 1908, analogous to the Young Turks, so to say, which also organized here in Geneva. Here, what is really interesting about the neutrality thing is maybe that very early, just after the outbreak of the war, when Germany violated Belgium's neutrality in the Schlieffen Plan, Rifat came up with this argument. He argued a lot with analogies, and he said everybody here, especially, of course, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, was completely outraged about this violation of Belgian neutrality in the war. And he's, how come everybody's so outraged about this, and what about us Egyptians? Our neutrality was equally violated and nobody cares. So this is an interesting argument, which then took an interesting turn later on. The second language, which we've now already heard about, is that kind of Pan-Islam, Muslim unity, of course, Muslim solidarity. The question of British occupation of Egypt became a question of Christendom versus Ummah, and a kind of ahistorical clash of civilizations situation. And of all the three prominent actors here, Farid was actually the one who was most vocal in this. He also founded a Pan-Islamic Society in Geneva. And I just added a couple of examples of these publications for you to look at. But this was also, of course, tied to the existence and the integrity of the Ottoman Empire, and it was very much tied to his personal kind of getting along with the Young Turks in Istanbul. So, yeah, we can talk about that later, maybe in the Q&A. Then the third one was, of course, kind of textbook nationalism, and this also underwent interesting transformations. It started, or it didn't start, but it kind of here in the Swiss sphere, among these Egyptians, it came up first as a fairly kind of reactionary argument with a lot of Egyptological pathos in the sense of, oh, let's all just not argue and be friends and love Egypt, and that's okay. And then later it kind of evolved into a national self-determination argument and the cultural unity, and of course also always the unity of Egypt with the Sudan, which is also implied in this. And then ultimately we have socialism, or kind of a socialist economic analysis of the situation. Here Rifat was the most prominent one to kind of advocate this actually early on already. Here, this is the only, so to say, framework within which the situation was actually one of imperialism. Imperialism was the problem. It was a global issue, not an inner Ottoman question, but the Egyptian question became an internationally relevant case that should interest everybody. So this is kind of the only really anti-imperialist position, so to say. It was, of course, internationalist and also the most radical one of the many of the different languages. Here, what is interesting maybe is that Rifat already kind of argued in a socialist framework before the war, so in 1912, 1913, and he was very closely connected with Indian radicals who were also in Switzerland, but even abroad. He'd come here from the US, where he was in contact both with socialists and with Indian radicals from the Ghadar movement. Exactly, but then actually the other Egyptians here in the circle, they weren't really they thought he was way too radical, and anyway they thought he was a difficult character, and they didn't want to kind of go this line. They stuck to their legal arguments. And then from 1917 onward, in 1917, Farid, the president of the National Party, was invited to Stockholm by Stockholm's socialist mayor Carl Lindhagen to attend pre-discussions of what was supposed to be the Stockholm Peace Conference or peace process. And there, Farid was obviously to some extent kind of radicalized, and he started also using the socialist argument. And what was very interesting in this now is that with this, the Belgium argument changed, and suddenly Belgium wasn't a co-victim such as Egypt violated kind of in its neutrality, but suddenly Belgium became another imperial power which violated the rights of African peoples in the Congo and so on. And also, so Farid took on this language kind of from 1917 onwards, but then particularly when, after the war, when they heard that Wilson was actually going to accept the mandate system in the League of Nations, they were completely disappointed. Before that, they had tried to also write to Wilson to kind of support them in their quest for national self-determination. And then even Farid started to turn to the socialists, and he started attending lots of socialist conferences in order to get their support for this cause. So here I come to an end. There's lots of points that we can discuss. I think, of course, we saw that the kind of Egyptian question emancipated itself from an inner Ottoman question, obviously with the fate on the course of the war to an international question. And also, each of these languages of legitimation relies on its own particular historical narrative, of course. And finally, we can see that they weren't really certain whether to make an argument of sameness or an argument of difference to get their rights, right? Because the international law framework is kind of we should be treated equally to everybody else, and we're just equal as any small, tiny European nation. But then Pan-Islam is kind of has maybe one strand, which is a bit of a superiority argument. We were like the cradle of civilization, and you all wouldn't even exist without us. I mean, I'm obviously being very roughly, of course not, but kind of like this. And then the socialism analysis is again one of kind of an international situation and class war. So yeah, that's all from me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you all very much for really interesting papers. So far there are no questions online yet, but I see questions in the room. I was going to propose to start from the back to change the order a little bit, but I only see hands in the front. Is that because you expect me to start from the front? In which case, I will actually start from the front. Daniel. And we'll collect a few. So Daniel, Alexander, here, Silas, and then we'll go to the second.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderfully, well, in many ways, coherent panel as well, because it really highlights the limitations of various ventures that are dubbed international, or the limitations of the term pan-Islamic as something that historians use. I've just got two brief questions connecting to perhaps historiographies and the way we might push them. And one refers to Jenny's paper, and I think in the printed, pre-circulated version, you also mentioned Jensen's book on terrorism and the kind of way in which, often the late 19th century, in the context of anarchist violence, is seen as a moment in which political violence gets onto the agenda within the international sphere of European governments and their relations and so on. And I was wondering whether your work ultimately kind of allows us to reconsider that kind of periodization, because your emphasis actually is on an earlier period, and where you're saying, I guess, in that kind of Chinese context, actually this is already an international debate, right? So does that mean that actually we need to rethink the way in which we've also written or thought about the histories of international counterterrorism, so to speak? And then with regard to Anna's paper, I was thinking, is there potentially a way for you to implicitly challenge Aris Manila's emphasis on the Wilsonian moment, because what you're presenting is a much wider history in which actually that engagement with Wilson is just such a small part, and actually other framing devices for international political commitments are potentially far more powerful. So, could we push, is that something that you'd contemplate, or something that is there as in the background? Thank you.
Alexander.
Well, thank you very much for these great papers. I have a question for Florian. Well, it's just possible that I don't know that much about the internal dynamics of the ICI, and I certainly don't. But I was very surprised when you were pointing out their positions on Islam, and also in your paper and in your book chapter on that. I was very surprised that there was so little on the role of Sufi brotherhoods that you mentioned, but mainly as a threat in Algeria and in a North African context. But then, of course, if we look at the level, and it's not even only the local level, but also how politique islamique, Islamic policy is shaped, for example, in the French case, it's much about, in the interwar period, about finding a consensus with Sufi brotherhoods like the Muridiya, like the Tijaniya, and in a way, I mean, the British in Nigeria do the same thing with the Qadiriya. So there is this idea that Islam in Black Africa, in inverted commas, is very different, that there is a Black Islam that needs to be protected and needs to be used. And how comes that at the ICI these things don't seem to come up, if I follow your argument? Thank you.
And then to Silas.
Thank you all so much. A quick question for LALE. There are scholars working on other pan movements who have done social histories of. In which ways could these be relevant to your, I think, absolutely great, point about what we need to do with the scholarship on Pan-Islam?
Let's do this and then we'll do another 3 afterwards.
Okay, so questions for LALE and for Florian. For LALE, it seems like many things are happening in the 1880s, right? The Ottomans are resurrecting the language of the Caliphate, and then they create this category of Mahmi for Muslims from protectorates. Meanwhile, there are restrictions on foreign Muslims' rights. That puts the Ottomans in this very tricky situation, right? Because of their Caliphate of difference, the Ummah just cannot have the same rights. How much of a pushback was there from within the Ottoman Empire and also from Muslim intellectuals in Central Asia and South Asia to this Caliphate of difference? Like, so, in other words, can we actually see a pan-Islamic reaction to how the Ottomans were not doing pan-Islam? And then I agree that pan-Islam is a very problematic framework when applied to the policy of the Ottoman state. Can you see it as still a useful framework in any way for Ottomanists or anyone studying the Middle East in a trans-imperial way? And for Florian, it sounds like the story that you're telling, it looks like a story of European imperial incorporation of Islam for colonial governance. But then in the introduction, you are saying that this is the colonial manipulation of pan-Islamic trans-imperialism. Could you expand on this term? What is pan-Islamic trans-imperialism? And is there a place for sovereign Muslim states at the time in that pan-Islamic trans-imperialism? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to start. Thank you for these questions. So I think that my answer to Cyrus's question about other pan movements and the relevance to this story or potentially useful analytical relationships would be, at least in this context, I would think of pan-Turkism, right? And there's been interesting work on pan-Turkism, but there too, I think it's very limiting. A lot of, if you think of James Meyer's work on pan-Turkism, a lot of the pan-Turkists are from Russia and are sort of failed at other projects before they become pan-Turkists and are becoming pan-Turkists when there is now a Turkey that's on the horizon, and that wasn't necessarily the way in which they saw the world or the things that were motivating them in their political commitments. So I think that is also a history that's often written based on the ideas of pan-Turkists themselves, and that shapes the narratives. And that when you read Ottoman sources from the late, the period, you don't see these categories, that much. You see them in certain places. There is a conflation of Islamic and Turkic identities, but really later, and it comes up in certain ways, obviously, and there is a development of a type of chauvinist approach to that. But so I would say, that's the closest thing that I can think of. And again, I find that to be a problem, at least for writing Central Asian and Ottoman histories and connections. But maybe from that I can connect it to, it's not that I'm not saying that these, as we see, in Anna's work and in lots of other people's work, of course there are these movements, right? And there are these connections that are forged among intellectuals and activists, many of them who are abroad, many of them who are, in the ways that Jimmy Leiden is writing, right? These ideas of Muslims as a racialized other against an enlightened, progressive Europe is creating solidarities among people and a language of resistance to that, right? So I, in no way am saying that that's not useful or worthy of our attention. I think that the differentiation that I'm trying to make is that this is not something that's very useful for understanding the articulation of policy or for the actions of individuals in their day-to-day lives and the kinds of things that animate imperial history, right? Outside of the journals and the sort of, that type of activity. So that is something that's happening, but it's perhaps on a different plane. And those are not necessarily conversations that are happening among the Ummah. There is no, to my mind, it's very problematic to think about a global Muslim subjectivity. Whose subjectivity? Which person? We're talking about an enormous empire. Muslims from across multiple, imperial frameworks. There are all of these different dynamics. So that kind of reductionism in some ways, I think, again, reifies these civilizational differences, right? And so I think it would be really productive to try to get out of that. But in terms of the question about, so going back to Vladimir's question about pushback from within the Ottoman Empire, so these attempts to limit the rights of foreign Muslims to engage with the extraterritorial legal order is what creates this sort of category of protected peoples that the Ottomans say, you're not really European subjects, you do not have the rights, right? You're not proteges. In the empire, the only protection to which you are entitled is the protection of the Caliphate, right? So they're not Ottoman subjects, they're liable to the protection of the Ottoman Caliphate. There is pushback to this, especially in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and among people who say, well, these people are not foreigners. These people are, these are cosmopolitan Muslim communities, particularly in places like Medina, with strong historical linkages to Central Asia. There's huge communities of Bukharans, Indian Muslims, all these people, lots of money circulating, for all these cash walks that are there. And it's like, we can't prevent these people from buying land. They're not foreigners. So what's really interesting there too is that you see engagement and pushback against ideas of nationality. What does it mean to be Ottoman in Medina to all these different Muslims? So yes, there's pushback, but it's not engaging with the terms of pan-Islam. It's about Islamic identity, right? So there isn't this category that everybody's engaging with about what it means to be Ottoman, right? Ottoman, like in many other settings, is a legal nationality. And so in a lot of these places, it's like, it's not the operative framework. The problem is that these are Muslims, these are the holy cities, these are not foreigners. So there's lots of types of pushback, but it's not articulated in that language. So that's what I say.
Thank you, Daniel, for your question. The question of whether or not we should rethink the history of, say, anti-terrorism, and I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that this is exactly what I'm trying to do. And there's already been scholarship done. Julia Jansen's book on terrorism, which just came out. Earlier, we have Barton Ingram's book on political crime from the 1980s. All of those works were longue durée, from the French Revolution all the way to the 1980s, or even the present in Julia's case. But I think that the problem is that historians have not been making enough use of these works by legal scholars, because these were written by, not historians, but legal scholars or scholars of international law. Some of them are very technical. So we have an abundance of literature on this, but if we have Sam Moyne's book, which is Human Rights, and I think that in many ways it is tied to my project, but it's very narrowly on the post-War II period. And so what I'm seeing is an opportunity to have conversations between historians and scholars of law, criminology, lawyers, and so on.
Yeah, thank you as well for your question. And I think that even though it's a small case study, but it would certainly absolutely challenge the Wilsonian moment narrative, because Wilson was really marginal, seemingly, in whom kind of these Egyptian exiles sought for support, both in the case of Rifat, who was already early on in these radical circles. They didn't play any role, obviously, and then Farid also came to find out about this kind of more via socialist circles, and then in the end, again, after the disappointment, they sought support from socialists. So I think that's definitely the case. Thank you.
Florian?
Yeah, thank you for all these questions. I tried to be short. Of course, there is a long kind of discussion behind that in the ICI that you can approach via the people who are participating, and in this case, it's mainly Arabists who then influence on the others, also the colonial administrators. And maybe there are three different positions in the beginning, which is Becker from Germany, and then you have who is very afraid of the influence of pan-Islam, especially in the German colonies, and he sees the threat coming from both the Caliph, but also from the fatwas issued in Mecca and also from Al-Azhar, and of course, also from the Sufi brotherhoods, or not the Sufi brotherhoods, but Senussia in particular. And then is Snooker Gornje, who is from the Netherlands and active in Indonesia, where he successfully cooperated with Islamic leaders there, especially Said Uthman, who has received a biography recently, and this works very well. And then there's Louis Massignon from France, who has this kind of mythological idea of a fusion between Christianity and Islam in this sort of Abrahamic common religion, who is using Andalusia also as the perfect place where the both religions live together, which is of course not the case, but these three positions are there, and then they negotiate, and in the end they come to the conclusion that Islam is actually sort of co-colonizer or something you can use, and in particular pan-Islam is not a threat to colonial empires but can be used for it, and that is where they develop their positions from. So they are discussing that, and they're talking about the Senussia, but then they say Tijaniya proves that there is a better way of cooperating with Islamic institutions. Partly they trace that idea back, and the British members come in there, the experience of the mutiny in 1857, which is very important for the ICI. In the version of the idea that the mutiny was actually caused by the British because they were too harsh on the people, and the ICI sort of is also established thinking that they can do it better, of course, as independent experts, and in the end cooperate also with Islamic institutions. And this idea is very strong, I would say, in the ICI. Maybe to the second question, of course, this is a matter of how you define transimperial. I think is something that should not be monopolized by cooperation between European powers and experts, but there's also transimperial dimension from those people who are called colonized or indigenous, and I think this is important to take into account, and probably it's most visible in pan-Islamic networks, obviously. If there is the possibility of an independent Muslim state is an interesting question. The ICI very early, partly even in the 1920s, embraces the idea that decolonization is okay if it's not complete independence, and if the people who are decolonized are loyal to the former colonizers. And they pursue this idea after 1944 when they were reestablished. And I think their idea is something like giving the colonies sort of dominion status or sort of independence and commonwealth relationships. And they, of course, link that then also to the idea of Eurafrica. And I think that is the way how they think. They have this idea that a governmentality of these regions and people establishes a sort of dependence between colonizers and the colonized, or former colonizers and the colonized, and that this is enough, that they don't need the colonial state to maintain this dependency. And I think this is very important to understand when talking about the ICI.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yes. Let's start there on that row.
Thank you. Lala, I think what you're doing is really important, and not only intellectually, but politically as well, because in general, there's this reification, essentialization, whatever, of Islam, of Muslims. We know that from the United States and in Europe as well. But there seem to be two strands to what you were saying. One is a critique of the historiography and the way this all-encompassing approach of pan-Islam has dominated the writing of the story of the late Ottoman Empire. And that seemed to me incredibly and very effectively effective. The second one is maybe even more important, and that is this attack on what you called essentializing Muslim subjectivity, as if it were single. But what if we turn the story upside down? And I say this from a personal, political, intellectual point of view because I wrote a book on the Armenian genocide. It's not that expensive if you want to buy it. It's Princeton
Mine
University
too, it's only $25.
Yeah. And they can live in the desert but nowhere else. Okay, so in that book, I try to criticize or attack even the notion that the genocide was an Islamic versus Christian event. That notion doesn't die easily among Armenians, but also was resurrected in another book by Benny Morris, and I can't remember the second author. It affects Greeks and everyone else. So there must be something left of Islam and of how the regime felt, maybe more sympathetically, more trustworthy of Kurds, let's say, than they did of Armenians, even though Kurds revolted far more often in the 19th and early 20th century in the Ottoman lands than the Armenians ever did. And yet it's the Armenians and the Assyrians who are going to be targeted. So where do we end up with that? How can we not fall into these essentializing categories, but at the same time, somehow talk about the importance of these religious elements?
And then to Ulrike.
Thank you. My question is for Florian, and it's connected with Alexander's question. I was wondering, how do you think, how much was the influence of the ICI on colonial policy of its members? Because when I tried to look it up a bit on the British case, and in the 1920s, the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, they just didn't pay attention at the ICI. So that was tie up quite good with what Alexander said, that they did things in Nigeria and so on and so on. And you showed clearly that the ICI had a lot of influence on international organizations in Europe, but I don't think it had so much influence on the actual colonial policy. Or did you find other examples? I just looked it up a little bit in the 20s, and that is my question. Yeah.
And then to the gentleman at the back, and then to Ben.
Hi, thank you. Super interesting panel. I have two questions or comments, one pertaining to law and the other is probably more related to the empire. I was wondering whether the two papers on China and Ottoman invite us to reconsider what happens to legal pluralism in the context of the emergence of a more definitive body of international law in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And if we do, then how is Islamic law being configured as within this tradition of legal pluralism in the late 20th century? And maybe this is something that could be related to the paper on the ICI, whether in fact we are seeing a certain tendency towards municipalizing, if you like, Islamic law by containing it within particular territories rather than recognizing its pan-Islamic, I use that word with all the due qualifications you pointed out, pan-Islamic jurisdiction. Which kind of takes me to my puzzle about the empire here and the relationship that law might have for enabling us to think about interimperial to transimperial and their relationship to the international. I'm kind of thinking of the historiography on the Ghadar movement, for instance, in the United States, this is a South Asian radical movement in the United States, which is trying to kind of capitalize on gaps between the jurisdictions of the American and the British empires to set up an anti-colonial movement within the United States. That's an Indian anti-colonial movement within the United States. And what you see in the course of the early part of the 20th century is a trans-imperial collaboration, if you like, between Britain and the United States to empty out or basically seal up these inter-imperial spaces. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, inter-imperial, trans-imperial to international may have a trajectory that may be visible through law in ways that could actually be productive for the bigger conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. My question was actually to all four speakers. What I was struck by in listening to all four papers is how categories that are, or terms that are very ideological as well as very affectively charged can also be extremely instrumentally used. And I think that what we have historiographically seen over a certain period of time is the attempt to divide affect from instrumentality. And I wonder if the papers actually speak to each other very well to talk about how you can use a category that is inflected with a lot of loyalty and emotion in a very directly instrumental manner, and sometimes simultaneously using the languages together.
And then I saw one other. Are there more questions for now? Then maybe to Leila first. And then if the panel could comment after that.
Thank you. Question for Anna. Do the men you research, or how actually, how do they use these and where these different registers of Ottoman, Arab, Egyptian, and how does it factor in their sort of claims or to rights or writing about sort of this writing about rights, whether it's national or religious, sort of in these different registers, like how I don't know if I'm wording this right, but how can you find from what they've left behind the ways in which they think about these different registers and how they think of using them, and why they choose Ottoman versus Arab versus Egyptian? And a question for LALE. Could you say something about the legacies of these different conceptualizations of not just individual loyalty or understanding of these loyalties for the people that you research, but also sort of these sort of broader conceptions or misconceptions of yes, pan-Islam too, but also how does it work in, post-imperial period and let's say in the Hijaz versus, let's say, Turkey. Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to go first?
My comment is very short, so I'll just get it out of the way. With regard to legal pluralism, there has been some work done in the Qing context. Castle is an example. And I think that that's a very crucial context for the work that I'm trying to do. The idea of personal jurisdiction, for instance, of different people governed by different laws. And I think that it's possible for a person to change simply how they dress and how they appear, and then go to different consulates and appeal to different laws. And this being the decades before the instruments of passports and citizenship was established, it was very possible and indeed common for people to claim multiple allegiance to their advantage. And this also connects to the comment about sealing up space. And I think that this is exactly what Adam McCune, in his Melancholy Order, is trying to do there.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much for your questions. About how they use these categories, I think it's really similar to your the dressing idea, how they dress differently in order to get different allegiance. So here what I maybe didn't say very clearly is that there also funding obviously also played a role. So of course, like for these pan-Islamic journals were funded by Istanbul mostly, and then at some point German money became available for certain kinds of arguments. And then there was one of the group of the Egyptian students here, then at some point got funded by the British, and then he started making these Arab Arab nationalist claims. So it was partly a matter of money. They were all seemingly short of money and happy to receive from whoever was willing to give. And then it also it seems like it's extremely flexible. What I also didn't say very clearly is that they all use these registers in parallel for different publications without any problems. And yeah, they're just kind of playing the game really well. So it doesn't seem, some things are kind of, there were some debates. For example, I think the slogan of the Egyptian National Party was Egypt to the Egyptians. And there was this debate of whether it should be to the Muslims or not, or should it include the Copts, yes, no, obviously. And then there was also the Rifat wanted and by the Egyptians to be added, and then Farid thought that was going to be way too radical. And then later he started considering this, that maybe by the Egyptians is a fair addition to the slogan. So there were lots of internal debates and conflicts about what to do, but in the end, I think actually Fahmi, the guy that I didn't have a photograph of, unfortunately, is the only one who just stuck to this legalistic approach, and he didn't really venture very far otherwise. But the other two, they didn't actually use Arab very much. It was mostly, just Egyptian or Muslim. These were the two terms they used.
Thank you for these questions. I will start with Ron's question about, so just to restate, I feel like it's been a while since you asked it. So the critique of the historiography and then the essentializing of Muslim subjectivities, but then what happens in the sense of religious identities, right? Like, or ethnic identities, and how do we get to the genocide, or how, right? So I think that I actually addressed this in the book, in the conclusion, and it's actually through engagement with a scholar who works on the genocide, right? One who was a fellow student with me at NYU, Larna Ekmekçoğlu. So my fellow Ottoman and Turkish Republican historian, Larna Ekmekçoğlu, wrote a beautiful book on the aftermath of the genocide and reconstituting the Armenian community. And in the Turkish Republican era, she argues that Armenians, although they became citizens of the Turkish Republic, were never regarded as full citizens, and that the state adopted earlier sorts of methods of rule, drawing on the millet system, and that they became what she terms secular dhimmis, right? So that they were Turkish citizens, but because Turk and Muslim, Sunni Muslim, were conflated, even though it was an ostensibly secular state, that they never occupied a type of full citizenship in the empire. And so I tried to engage with this idea, and this is a complicated argument, maybe I'm not doing a great job explaining it, but I think that what I try to do is that I'm making an argument, right, about that this is about legal nationality in the book. So that my problem with pan-Islamism in this context is it doesn't help us to understand how Muslims are differentiated and treated as foreigners. But when the capitulations are unilaterally abolished by the Ottomans before the First World War, the problem of Muslims being foreigners is not one that really is a problem anymore, because their foreignness is contingent upon their access to the capitulations and European protections, right? So when they no longer have those types of privileges, they don't constitute a threat, and they can very easily naturalize and become Ottoman subjects and then later Turkish citizens, right? So I'm not saying actually that religion doesn't matter. I think religion matters very much, right? But in very complicated ways. And that the emphasis on Pan-Islamism prevents us from seeing actually some of these things. And that actually many people, right, the resistance, so this is the question that Vladimir asked, the resistance to these types of policies are coming from communities of pious Muslims, right, where they're saying that these people are not foreigners, that their understanding is that they belong because they're Muslim, right? And I think a lot more work has to be done in that regard. I guess the key is that their foreignness is based on their relationship to international law, actually, and their access to the capitulations. So related to that, I mean, in the question regarding legal pluralism and international law in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and Islamic law, this is also a very, very complicated story, right? So that the Ottomans, it's not like Sharia law is the dominant law of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the empire. So there is major legal reform that begins in the Tanzimat period, and that continues through the Hamidian era that is seen as this very Islamic period in which Sharia is one of, as throughout Ottoman history, it's one component of law. There is multiple different types of legal orders. Legal pluralism, becomes a problem for these states that are in the hierarchy of international law that are not seen as civilized states, that are the quasi, the semi-civilized states where there are these competing regimes of protection and is a real problem of sovereignty for empires that are struggling to defend their sovereignty. So legal pluralism can offer wonderful opportunities for people who can figure out how to game that system, but it's not necessarily always one of opportunity, right? So for the people that I'm studying that are from protected states, they're actually looking at a picture in which their rights are massively constrained. So it's really complicated in that regard. But I don't think that we can talk about something called pan-Islamic jurisdiction, right? There is a modernized legal order that's complicated with courts of cassation, and this is different in the Central Ottoman lands and in Egypt and all of these types of places. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but again, it's really complicated. And then in terms to Leila's question about legacies, the legacies of these kinds of conceptions and these misconceptions, I think maybe I'll take it up from where you asked about what falls out, right? So I think that what falls out of this picture is these connections across these Islamic lands, and the conflation often of pan-Islamism and pan-Turkism actually leaves out very important historical connections and geographies in this story. So if we are thinking about an Ottoman order and an Ottoman world, people are imagining these kinds of connections between Central Asia as the birthplace of the Turks, and then it's like and then Turkey is the successor to the Ottoman Empire. But all of these geographies that fall out are like what becomes Saudi Arabia, right? Or Jerusalem or Damascus, where there are these very large communities of Central Asians, right? That especially in Saudi Arabia, where in Medina is a city where you still have, in Saudi Arabia, large diasporic communities of Buharans, of different types of Central Asians, and they don't fit into that story anymore because it becomes one about ethnicity. But really, part of what I argue in the book is that the Hajj becomes a form of migration that connects people from Central Asia to Ottoman lands, not just to what becomes Turkey. So it's not based on their ethnicity. It is really, it's a type of it's a ritual that is a type of migration that connects people across these spaces. And that trying to understand this only in terms of these, modern kinds of conceptions of identity that are then ahistorically read back into that period doesn't explain why there are these communities of Turkic peoples throughout the Middle East, right?
Okay, Florian, after that we've got a question online or two questions online for Jenny, and I think then we'll wrap it up. So if we can keep it answer slightly short, then that would be good. Florian?
Yes, thanks. So to keep it short, all questions are very good, but also very difficult to answer. But I don't leave it there. To Ulrike's remark, I think this is really hard to determine. There are also over 700 people running the ICI, and you never know how much of the ICI's publications they are reading, but I assume that they do if they are members. So for those who are really very active in the ICI, like Snooker Ronja and we have like a lot of letters from him. I think he wrote 3 to 4 letters a day. Also telling us that he met like the people he met at the ICI meeting personally, or invited them to his house, and they stayed overnight, and got interested in his daughter, and all these kind of stories. So they seem to be very close. How their trans-imperial exchange and activity translated into real policy is always hard to determine, but I think someone like Snukogonje was said to have basically run the Indonesian colonial government in Java for a long time, and I think it is valid to claim that was very influential, and others were not. So of course it's difficult to come to a general conclusion, but the fact that also very important colonial, I mean, they call themselves reformers, like Haley, you mentioned him, and the African Survey, Lugard and Lyoté. They were not super present in the ICI, but they sort of represented this idea that we have to switch to governmentality and indirect rule. And that brings me maybe to the question of concepts, and that they can be instrumentalized. And I think as a historian, I always try to historicize them. Also, ideas like governmentality, for example, which ICI members used, not using the same term, but basically the concept. And that is very important, and it becomes more important later on when they call themselves, as I mentioned, the Institute of Differing Civilizations. They always have something in mind, and instrumentalize the idea that there are equal civilizations in the world, and there shouldn't be any colonial relationships between them. In the 1950s, when they also admit representatives from Eurafrica or from independent colonies to join the ICI, there's a long debate about anti-racism, and actually the white ICI members managed to appropriate this idea and say that violent anti-colonialism is actually anti-racism against the white people who are in Africa. And there is a long debate, and Senghor is arguing against that, who is in the ICI in the 1950s. And so they even managed to appropriate and instrumentalize ideas that we would basically claim for anti-colonialism, anti-racism. And yeah, the segmentary view of Islam is certainly very present, but things are definitely more complex. They use both the idea of pan-Islam and the segmentary society based on Islam to argue in favor of colonial governmental domination, I would say. Interestingly, the person Snukogonje is cooperating with closely in Indonesia, in Java. Said Uthman, whom I mentioned already, is the one who claims to bring the real Islam to Indonesia, and is also quite successful in imposing this kind of program and portraying himself as the one who brought the real Islam to Indonesia. So it's really complex. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. Then there are 2 questions by Peter Lavelle for Jenny. Thanks for sharing this fascinating project with us. First, what percentage of extradition cases in this period involved suspects who were apprehended in foreign jurisdictions around China, such as Hong Kong, foreign concessions in Shanghai, and so on, versus more distant locations in Southeast Asia, the Americas, and Europe? So that's the first question. And the second question is, your project grapples with legal issues in an era when political activists were fighting against both political authorities in China and the manifestations of foreign imperialism in China. So, in light of the fact that extraterritorial jurisdictions gave legal shelter to political activists, how should we make sense of the relationship between critiques of quote-unquote authoritarian China, and movements to end extraterritoriality in China?
Thank you so much, Peter. These are great questions. I've only looked at cases that have been documented, and I could only assume that there might be more, but we don't have cases that are documented in the British Archive in Kew. And my sense is that because I'm looking more at these high-profile cases, low-profile cases, if they don't get the attention of the press, if they don't get the attention of the diplomats, they don't get noticed. And petty criminals are handed back and forth all the time, right? And so those are the cases that I don't have access to. But high-level cases, especially those involved entire communities feuding. I looked at a case where a group of 13 people escaped from Canton to Hong Kong, where they became Christians and sought refuge under the Catholic Church and claimed the status of, they were being persecuted for their religious affiliation when, according to the local Chinese archive, this case had nothing to do with religion. It was, an inter-clan feud over properties. And so those high-profile cases were rare. So probably 8 or 10 during the entire late Qing period. And more distant regions, I have not seen them, partly because it would be pretty difficult, I think, that in terms of logistical, how do you get to these places without, being a high-profile person, without, being sent back. And I think that Sun Yat-sen is the and Liang Qichao and Kang Wei, the reformers of the late 19th century, those were the higher profile cases, and only a few. So, I don't know how useful it is for us to be looking at percentages. So in terms of the political authorities, political authorities and anti-imperialist activists, and I think this is a great question. And what I'm trying to do is to look at how these rebels and revolutionaries constantly shift their position depending on who they were caught and depending on at what court their cases were being heard. And these shifts are very interesting. And they had allies, they had legal counsel. Sun Yat-sen, for instance, were very good friends with Ho Kai, a barrister in Hong Kong. And they also had connections to the more indigenous sort of rebels who had simply economic grievances against, local authorities. And so I think it's more useful to think of these people as a network of subversive activists who were able to style and to shift their positions depending on the legal challenges that they were facing.
Silas, can we add a small question? Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, it is actually. You're second then. No, that's totally fine. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just listening to, I was gonna actually, in the spirit of talking across the panel, I wonder, because I had a question about, the idea of the political crime, the political criminal, and how this emerges at a particular place. But in terms of, I wonder if it's worth also thinking about in earlier periods of indigenous, people acting against the state, the use of violence, again, that type of violence versus legal instruments to, maybe tracing that and thinking about that would also be interesting here. I know that this, sorry.
And I think that what you see over the course of the 20th century is increasingly, you don't need to throw a bomb in order to upset a political order. And so I think that there were other ways of subversive press, financial crimes, right. And so what you see is the separation between the acts of the criminals and the ideas and the ideology, right?
I don't mean by the criminals. I mean by the state.
Oh, by the state,
right? So that if we're thinking of that, there's a shift towards criminalizing certain acts and then using legal instruments versus earlier periods in which there are things that are construed as political acts against an order where the response is violence.
Right,
Right,
absolutely.
right, yeah.
And I think that, going back to Foucault, the idea of sort of disciplining instead of harsh visible punishment, and the idea is that then you're not alienating, upsetting people with what you do, and you can seem to be pretty liberal, and you provide the possibility of correcting the behavior of these people, and so with the legal reform of the Qing in 1909, you definitely see this change. And what happens when you go from one day slicing people to death, right, to imprisoning them for like 2 years and then letting them go. This is a very sudden shift.
We're going to be on a panel together in a few years, probably, talking about these issues.
Yeah. Just two very quick sort of notes. That now I think with you. There was a book written exactly about this pretty quick
It is pretty quick transition from real harsh corporal punishment for crimes against the state to crimes against the state that are much less, corporal in Iran in the late 19th century. There's a pretty sort of, quick shift, which is really interesting. And second point, very quickly, I think it was Ziad Fahmy who, in the context of Egypt 1840 to 70, came up with this concept of legal chameleon.
Yeah.
Right, it was him, right? So, and that's really interesting. I just thought about this. The context is different, right? Because it's in one country, right? I mean, and so, but it's maybe something to think with. Yeah.
That's it.
Okay, then we're 5 minutes late, 6 minutes late.
You're in cruise.
Thank you very much.